Well, hey everyone. I'm making this quick video just to kind of help as you're preparing for uh, this meeting, this gathering for your Sunday community group, where we look at the first session for Habakkuk. Hopefully, last week you were able to kind of set up the book and give an overview of it. But now we're diving into the text. So I just wanted to go over some key things that are in the curriculum that you can emphasize, and just hopefully this is another added resource for you in preparation. So here we are in Habakkuk, and hopefully as you were able to emphasize last week, and if not, just emphasize it again, the whole book of Habakkuk is really structured as this conversation between the prophet, Habakkuk, and God. And it begins with the prophet, with Habakkuk actually going to God and ushering a complaint. Complaint is a strong word, but I think it's going to help people really reckon with what Habakkuk is doing. He's not complaining and grumbling in a negative sense, but he's looking out and he's seeing something, and it creates this burden in him. That's actually another way that you can translate this word here. It's pronouncement, but it can also be translated as burden. And so the prophet is looking out. He's seeing something, and it's creating this burden in him. And so he's bringing that burden to the Lord. He's asking, how long must I call out for help, and you do not listen, or cry out to you about violence, and you do not save? So he's complaining that God is not doing certain things. He's not listening, and he's not saving. This language really reminds us of the Exodus account, if you're familiar with Exodus, where God's people cry out. They're being oppressed under Egypt. They cry out. God hears their cries and then moves to save them. And so Habakkuk is tapping into this memory, this event of where God did hear the cries of his people and did save. He's kind of using that same language. And he's comparing them. He's saying, God, you heard the cries of the people in one instance, and you moved. And why aren't you moving now? Why is heaven silent now? And so he's asking this question, why? 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 There's a lot of whys there. But what is he burdened about? And this could be very helpful in just teasing out some things. He sees something in Judah where he's a prophet, where he's ministering amongst God's people that is out of whack. It's things like injustice, wrongdoing, oppression, violence, strife, conflict. He's saying there's all of this being stirred up in the community. There's injustice, there's wrongdoing, there's oppression and violence, strife, conflict. And the reason we know that it's for the community of God's people is because of this complaint, that the law is ineffective. What we know is the word for the law is Torah, and this is what God gave to the Israelites as he brought them out of Egypt. He took them to a mountain and gave his instructions. That's what Torah is. It's his guidance. Sometimes we translate it law, but it's really this broader category of the instruction that God gave to his people so that they could live into who he called them to be. And so that was for the people of Israel. The law, the Torah, was not given to all the nations. It was given to Israel, to the people of God, including Judah, to almost broadcast a message to the world of God's wisdom. Deuteronomy 4 talks about this. So for Habakkuk to complain or to be burdened by the law being ineffective or paralyzed, that's how I think the NIV translates it. It's good translation, I think. For him to complain that Torah is paralyzed or ineffective is to say something about God's people. So he's not simply complaining or bringing his burden of seeing injustice in the world. He sees this injustice in God's people, and that's what really bothers him. And it's robbing God's people of their purpose. It's making them ineffective and paralyzed to do what they were supposed to do. And one of the things that receives kind of special prominence is this idea of justice. He says, because of all this stuff at work, justice never emerges or comes about. For the wicked restrict the righteous, and justice comes out perverted again. So you see it linked here again. So justice receives special attention throughout all of this. You got injustice, justice, justice. It receives this special attention of really what's at the heart of what's being missed or thwarted. God had called them to be a just society, and they weren't doing that. So Habakkuk is burdened with that. So as you move down, I just want to, in the curriculum, we try to zone in on this idea of justice. I linked a Bible Project video where they tackle this theme from a biblical standpoint. They kind of look at this theme throughout the whole narrative of Scripture. I think it's great. But another thing that you can do is have people read these scriptures aloud and just talk about what are some aspects of justice that stick out to you based on these passages. And then you can go to James 1 and ask, what does it look like for the church to exercise justice in light of these things? Now, this could be a really sticky subject. Justice is kind of a buzzword in our culture today, especially around social justice. And what I think is really helpful is to recapture that justice is a biblical idea, and it's a high call for the people of God to enact, right? That's what Habakkuk is complaining about. The justice is not emerging. That's a problem. God's people are supposed to be those who work towards a just society. So that's one sense. We need to make sure we're emphasizing that. But on the other end, we need to make sure that we really define what that justice looks like. And if there is necessary distinction between what is talked about today as social justice. And I think there is. There is a distinction between what biblical justice is and, say, social justice, or what we can call secular justice and critical theory that we see today. Tim Keller has a great article on this. It's called A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory. It's a little dense. He's working a lot from a philosopher named Alistair MacIntyre, who writes just really thick, dense books on philosophy and ethics and whatnot. But Keller, if you're not familiar with Tim Keller, he's a great pastor who kind of distills a lot of this stuff. And in this article, which you can read, he compares secular ideas of justice to biblical ideas of justice. And he organizes it around kind of these 5 facets of justice. He says these are 5 facets of justice that we find in biblical ideas of justice. There's the idea of community. So other people have a claim on my wealth, so I must give voluntarily. There's the idea of equity, that everyone must be treated equally and with dignity. There's the idea of responsibility, both corporate and individual. And he has scriptural passages throughout the article to kind of outfit each of these points. But we need both of these to see both of these. That there's a corporate responsibility for when it comes to people's sins, and there's an individual responsibility, both of those. You can see this with the story of Achan, and I think Judges 7, or Ananias and Sapphira. There's a corporate responsibility there when it comes to protecting the holiness and the devotion of the community. Again, there's biblical examples in here. I'm just kind of giving this as a resource for you if you want to get more clarity. So community, equity, responsibility, and then advocacy. We must have special concern for the poor and the marginalized. And this is really what I was trying to draw out by citing these passages. Like there's this idea of advocacy for the poor, for the marginalized, for the foreigner, that is really important to biblical ideas of justice that really gets carried through into James 1. So this idea of advocacy. But that's not the only thing that's involved in biblical justice. You can also see community, equity, corporate, and individual responsibility. So Keller compares these to a spectrum of secular conceptions of justice that range from individualism to collectivism. I know there's a lot of big words there, but this is what can be considered a spectrum on secular ideas of justice. On one end, you have individualism, represented by guys like Locke, David Hume, that basically asserts that you are wholly the product of your individual choice. And so what does that mean for justice? Well, it means justice is really all about making sure that there's freedom and granting equal freedom to everybody. So that's one end. On the other end is collectivism, where you get more of Marxist ideas, that you're wholly the product of certain social forces and structures and institutional power and whatnot. So what is justice in that conception? It's all about power. Justice is all about making sure that there's no more power dynamics at play and everything kind of gets flattened out. That's the postmodern kind of idea. And in the middle, you have some other kind of expressions of what justice is all about. You have the liberal conception, where it's all about fairness, and there's a lot there about distributive fairness and procedural fairness and all this stuff. Then you have utilitarian ideas, where justice is all about happiness, making sure everybody can pursue what they find to be sources of their own happiness. So again, you can look at the article for more detail. But Keller looks at the libertarian, liberal, utilitarian, and postmodern conceptions, these four, and he compares them to the biblical idea of justice. And in the end, he finds that biblical justice is better than secular alternatives for four reasons. First, only biblical justice addresses all the concerns of justice found across the fragmented alternative views. In other words, only biblical justice hits all five of these. Secular views of justice may get at, say, corporate responsibility, but not emphasize individual responsibility. Like postmodern notions of justice don't talk about individual responsibility a lot. Whereas, say, libertarian ideas don't emphasize that there's a corporate responsibility and whatnot. Okay, so what Keller says is biblical justice hits all five of these. Second, biblical justice contradicts each of the alternate views, neither by dismissing them nor by compromising with them. So what he's saying is biblical justice incorporates the good of each theory and also provides what each one is missing. So it's taking the good parts of what people see in just society and also filling it out. Biblical justice can do that. Third, biblical justice has built-in safeguards against domination. So there's this grounded moral truth, which with guys like Hume and Locke, there's often this difficulty in finding an objective kind of moral standard to appeal to in order to build a just society. So the Bible and Christianity has that. But also, there are safeguards against that objective morality becoming oppressive or becoming a source of power in and of itself, which really plays into this fourth part where only biblical justice offers a radically subversive understanding of power. So the biblical story can critique the corruption of power while also providing a profound model for confronting it, the cross of Christ. Again, this gets really messy, and it's kind of some dense philosophical stuff. It wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. It's not my lane that I love to swim in. But I think what Keller provides us is with a thoughtful, methodical treatment of comparing biblical justice to secular ideas of justice. And what he's trying to do is to ignite in us a redemptive recapturing of the idea of justice. I liked this. There's nothing in the world like biblical justice. Like biblical justice has something to offer to the world. And Christians must not sell their birthright for a mess of pottage. In other words, don't settle for secular notions of justice. And at the same time, don't abandon justice altogether because the Bible has something to say about it. So we have to make sure we're balancing those two things. So we must take up the birthright and do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with their God, Micah 6:8. I mean, this is profoundly model for us in Jesus. This is from One Bible Dictionary, talks about this. True social justice includes speaking for the poor and caring for the widow and the orphan. These actions were the purview of the king and leader in the first instance, meaning it was the job of the king and leader to make sure that there's advocacy for the marginalized and the downcast. And failures on the part of the king and leader would constitute grounds for God's judgment on the king, leader, and people alike. So with the heavy losses of land, king, and temple during the Babylonian period, which we're on the cusp of in Habakkuk, these failures also gave rise to the hope of a future leader who would lead with righteousness and justice. These are the terms that are used for the Messiah's program, that he would bring righteousness and justice. For us as Christians, this expectation was met in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. With regard to Jesus, Luke 1:32 states, "He will be great and he will be called Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David." Matthew 12 identifies Jesus as the servant in Isaiah 42, which talks about the Messiah coming to lead with righteousness and justice, part of whose tasks is to proclaim justice to the nations. So Jesus brings justice. Jesus fulfills this problem of injustice that we see. And so, although justice is a buzzword in our culture today and can get messy and confusing, I think there's a call for us to redeem it. So, as you go throughout the rest of the curriculum, there's a lot of things that I think are fairly straightforward. This kind of situates Habakkuk in his timeline, where he's at specifically. He's in the 6th and 7th century or so, between Assyria conquering Israel and before Babylon destroys them. So he's around here. More specifically, you can situate him in Jehoiakim's reign, which was marked by injustice and violence. Talk a little bit about protest, the word complaint. But I think what we need to see is that Habakkuk is bringing this burden to God because he knows only God can fix it, and only God can reckon with the problem. And so this is really the beginning of faith. And it can be brash. It can be a little brutish, honest and raw. But the Bible's filled with that. We'll talk a lot about that throughout this series. And then, we got some good questions that I think emphasize sharing and getting people to kind of share in that. And then the encouragement for the practice this week is pray. A lot of good stuff. I'm excited. This video is already longer than I wanted it to be, but that topic of justice is a little dicey, so I just wanted to make sure you felt resourced to talk about it. And if you have any further questions, feel free to shoot me an email, set up a phone call, coffee, lunch, whatever. But thanks for all you do and how you serve here at Lake Norman Baptist. We appreciate you.